do just want to preface that I know the difference between AFL and American football, but I'm a visual person and was trying to get something a little bit football-like. So just pretend it's AFL footballs and an AFL field and we'll do well. My colleague in this from the law faculty here at Bond, Annette Greenhow, isn't here, so any lawyers that are going to challenge any legal aspects I may mention, I'll pass over to my lawyers that I have on the panel. So quickly, we won't go too much into the background of the study. I think Matt covered the Essendon saga, so I won't delve into that. I'm taking a different perspective, looking at regulation and legitimacy of this whole problem. So basically, the governance and management of what has been going on. And then we'll look at a theoretical framework of social capital to actually address and explain what has been going on in this relationship. So you know most of these issues here. Obviously the photo that we had that Bob put up this morning was the ACC report. Darkest day in history. We're all expecting bad things. Took a little while to come. The main thing here was that the Essendon Football Club, they did, once their name came out, they did self-report to ASADA that this had been going on. So that was the first step that's important for my presentation. Secondly is the joint investigation of ASADA and the AFL, that agreement, and that's what we're looking at from a regulation and also from a legal framework. So the two organisations, obviously, that are of importance, just some brief facts to sort of understand where they sit in Australia. AFL, they average about 30,000 people per game. Most popular sport. The annual revenue is enormous. And again, they are financially independent from government. And there's no international governing body. So I think, as Matt mentioned, they are prosecutor, judge, jury. They are a law unto themselves. Okay, so we need to think about that. ASADA, on the other hand, yes, the wider code, they work in compliance to that. Revenue of about 15 million. And again, they are the statutory regulator that is meant to act independent of any influence from any government or any other organisations. So while they are government funded, they are meant to be removed and independent. So looking at the joint investigation. So the investigation was to further examine the Essendon Football Club supplement scandal. So the collaboration came about is that ASADA doesn't have or the resources, either human resources or financial resources, to actually investigate Essendon Football Club. And they hoped that, and Andruska, the previous CEO of ASADA, wanted to use the AFL so that the AFL could draw upon their relationship with the clubs and the players through a contract they have to get them to have interviews and actually talk to the ASADA people and the AFL people. So the investigation, 7 months, 130 interviews, and it did cost the AFL 1.3 million. And I think Matt questioned, why did they get involved? And again, I think he summed it up by saying they wanted to be seen as good citizens and other reasons that will be obvious in this report a little bit later. So the results obviously showed 34 cause notices, and this is still ongoing, as we know. So the federal court proceedings that took place, again, when Essendon filed complaints that this joint investigation was unlawful, unwarranted, after it had gone to the federal court came back and said that ASADA had not acted outside its powers and that it agreed that that joint investigation was lawful. So I guess significance in the federal court findings also suggested that there was confusion in the management of the anti-doping regime. So there's ASADA's role, AFL, Essendon Football Club, and other actors in that space that no one really knew what their role was. So again, it was brought up that ASADA should be acting independently, and this was a recurring theme in the federal court case. They have an independent status, and this was challenged. And what came out as well prior to the federal court in a newspaper was there. We have the big guns of the Australian sports system. We have the chairman of the Australian sports system, we have the AFL commissioner, and we have the chairman of Essendon going off for a lovely little lunch to try to push this under the carpet as quickly as they could. Okay, so again, it's AFL, Australia's favourite sport. It's harming sport as an image, it's harming AFL, and it's bad to have the media involved. So they obviously want to have this ended quickly. So this focus is going to look at, obviously, the players involved in this case and look at their legitimate authority. So what powers do they have in managing this problem? So a theory by Bourdieu is the social theory concepts, and that's what the framework will help explain legitimacy and regulation. So I guess in terms of definitions and how we've justified this study, so regulation by Black is intentional action by any actor designed to alter or influence the behaviour of others. And then legitimacy, and again, probably the lawyers in the room will have some comments about this term, a generalised perception or an assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or within some socially constructed system of norms, values and beliefs. And that's important in this model I'm about to share with you. So socially constructed systems of norms and values. And I think that's quite important in the Australian culture. So question is, who possesses regulatory authority? So we have government actors who, in their parameters of legislation, do have powers to act. And that's pretty common knowledge. Non-government actors may not have legislative authority, but again, can have other forms of authority that can be just as significant. So Bourdieu's social theory looks at three main concepts. We have the social field. So that's the area, or it's a space in his work, but it's basically who is involved in any given situation. So who are the actors? Who are the dominant actors in this space? What is their relationship? How do they all fit together? So the social field is going to change depending on what discipline you're in or what issue you're actually talking about. Capital, various forms of capital, economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, and that can all be combined to develop what's called symbolic capital. And then the habitus. And what's been proven is that the habitus are the values, the norms, the beliefs within that social field that are developed by the actors in that space. Whereas Bourdieu didn't really examine the organisations, but he looked at the social field, how they operated, and who had the power in that field, and that's the important part. So actors struggle in this space to prove that they have power, they have prestige, and they can actually change behaviours in that space. So the theory has been applied across a number of researchers. My colleague O'Brien here did some work a while ago and found out that the dominant actors do play a very important role of determining the values or the habitus in the social field. Dominant actors, they are supreme and they have power and influence to actually change the status of that social field. And then symbolic capital, which is often the culmination of economic and those other areas, again, can be misrecognised. So what is actually capital and symbolic capital is often the confused area, which we'll have a look at in a moment. Bob here did a paper looking at drug use regulation in Australian sport and the role of ideology. Okay, so again, if we look at Australia, our love of sport, our norms, our values, our morals relating to sport, and I think we've discussed quite a few this morning, and again, it is driving our structure and operations of our sports system. So he suggests that the ideology is a means of legitimising the existing hierarchies that we have in sport. So if we look at the social field of the Essendon Football Club and the ASADA investigation, so Bob did a similar model which I've put the actors from this investigation into this. So down the bottom we have our economic capital and up the side the cultural and symbolic capital. So yes, technically ASADA should be a big player in this space, the Australian government should, But if we stop and think about the AFL as culturally significant actor, economic, definitely, and then symbolic, how they're perceived in this space, and they have the power. And obviously what Matt said, how they've come into this agreement, on the white horse, hoping to solve the problems, they are quite a big player in this space. So the findings of economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, and then symbolic capital, which is a result of the other capitals combined, you have a little bit of an idea of what levels of capital each of those actors have in this social field. And that's very important for determining how much power they can wield and how they can actually control the beliefs and values and norms within that social field. So perceived authority, and this is some terminology that Annette and I threw around a little bit. So the AFL is perceived to have significant power, prestige and authority in the social field that I just showed you a moment ago. So I guess they're considered to be the dominant actor in that social field. And again, that partnership with ASADA again enforces their dominance. ASADA needed them to conduct that investigation that further enhanced their authority in that space. And from the federal court hearings, ASADA actually starts to admit quite a few times that they weren't ready for the investigation into the Essendon Football Club. They knew they didn't really have the resources, the authority or the legitimacy to actually go in there and work in that investigation. And then if we think about legitimate authority, so ASADA, yes, they are the legitimate regulator of anti-doping in Australia, but it's not perceived by the other actors in that social field to have the authority. When the ACC report came out, ASADA knocked on many doors of many football clubs of different codes, and they didn't want to work with them. They weren't cooperative. ASADA sort of walked away, and again, the football codes were just happy to say, no, we can't speak at the moment. We're too busy. And they didn't have any power to actually change that. Again, ASADA CEO knew that if we team up with the AFL, we can use their powers, we can use their influence and get the results that we want. And that was, again, their rationale for joining with the AFL. So ASADA sought to gain social and symbolic capital through their collaboration with the AFL. So the findings, I guess, suggested that perceived authority as a result of symbolic capital is independent often of any legitimate authority that an actor may possess. So actors like the AFL, they have significant power and they're very dominant in that social space, but legally on paper, they probably don't have the power to do a lot of the things that they do. So other actors in the space, they're limited to change their behaviours or to actually act higher than that dominant actor because they don't have any power or status or reputation to enforce change. So Bourdieu has determined that perceived regulatory authority of actors, by looking at the theory, we can analyse who has the power, who doesn't have the power. So again, the ASADA CEO or past CEO have mentioned, they've come and confessed that they don't have any compulsory powers of their own. They can see that. And that is one of the biggest issues in this case. And they do rely on the cooperation of other bodies, particularly national sporting organisations, which the AFL is, to help ASADA be an effective regulator. And if that cooperation's not there, then the system does have some concerns. So there is a disconnect between perceived authority on the one hand and then legal legitimacy on the other. So again, in this case, the AFL has pretty much walked away squeaky clean from a lot of this investigation. The Essendon Football Club went after ASADA, not necessarily the AFL. So the AFL had access to resources and again had contractual control over the players and the teams to get them to cooperate. So the AFL actually raised in profile. It had more symbolic capital. It looked better out of this situation than ASADA. And further, the AFL Again, as we mentioned, more extensive symbolic capital to exert power over the players in that space. However, ASADA has lost symbolic capital, lost social capital following this collaboration. They're still in the media. And again, an article that was in yesterday's paper, quite relevant, was that ASADA warns it could appeal the Essendon case. So the new chief executive suggested that Essendon and the coach are to blame for the delays in securing a resolution for the supplement saga, and has warned he is likely to appeal any finding that is not a reasonable decision. So again, this potentially is going to be in courts for another 12 or so months. And that is pretty much the extent of my research. Thank you.